I don't remember the last time my parents said they were proud of me in a way that mattered. They would say things like, "Oh, that's nice, Sarah," whenever I shared an accomplishment, but it never held any weight, never came with the same warmth and enthusiasm they reserved for my younger sister Lily. I had always been the responsible one, the one who never needed saving, and for that reason, I was also the one they ignored. Meanwhile, Lily, their golden child, could do no wrong. She had been born 3 years after me, and from the moment she arrived, it was as if my parents had decided I was no longer worth their full attention. She was the miracle baby, the one they doted on endlessly, the one who could wreck my things as a child, take my clothes without asking as a teenager, and destroy their car as an adult without ever facing any real consequences. It had always been like that. I am 26 now, living in my own apartment, a place I worked hard for, a place that is entirely mine. It is not huge, but it is comfortable, safe, and something I take pride in because I earned it through years of saving and careful planning. My job is stable, my finances are in order, and yet my parents treat my independence as though it is a personal slight, as though my refusal to depend on them is some sort of betrayal. They never acknowledge my accomplishments the way they do with Lily, who, at 23, still lives at home, still expects them to clean up her messes, and still burns through their money as if it is infinite. I have never once heard them tell her no. No matter what she does, they find a way to excuse it, a way to justify it, a way to make it seem as though she is simply misunderstood or going through something difficult that requires patience and compassion. I have lost count of how many times I have had to bite my tongue while my mother lamented about how Lily is just sensitive, or how Lily needs extra support, or how Lily doesn't mean to be selfish. It is exhausting, infuriating, and worst of all, completely predictable. The only people who ever made me feel truly seen were my grandparents, Henry and Margaret. When I was a child, their home was my refuge, the place I ran to when the weight of being second best became too heavy to bear. My grandmother would make me tea and listen to my worries without brushing them aside, while my grandfather would slip me extra cookies and tell me stories about his childhood, making me laugh until I forgot why I had been sad in the first place. They loved me unconditionally, never made me feel like I had to fight for their approval, never made me feel as though I was an afterthought. When they passed away last year, I felt as though I had lost the only real family I had, the only people who had ever truly been on my side. The grief was unbearable, and what followed in the aftermath of their passing only made it worse. I had never expected to receive anything from their will, had never even considered it, but when it was read, I was stunned to learn that they had left me their house, the same house that had been my sanctuary for so many years. It was an old, beautiful home with wooden floors that creaked with every step, a kitchen that always smelled like fresh-baked bread, and a warmth that no other place had ever been able to replicate. It was in every way my home. And my parents were livid. "This isn't fair," my mother had snapped when the lawyer read the will, her voice sharp with indignation. "Lily should get something too." "She did," I had replied, my fingers tightening around the arms of my chair. "They left her money. More than enough for her to buy her own place if she wants to." "But you got the house," my father had said, his voice thick with anger, as if that fact alone was an unforgivable offense. Yes, I had gotten the house. Because my grandparents had known that I would cherish it, that I would take care of it, that I would not treat it as something to be sold off for quick cash. They had known that Lily would have put it on the market the second it became hers, that she would not have valued it the way I did. For weeks after that, my parents hounded me, pressuring me to sell the house and split the money with Lily. I refused. This was the one thing in my life that was mine, truly mine, and I was not going to let them take it from me. That was when the strange things started happening. At first, they were small enough to make me doubt myself. Mail went missing. My porch light was shattered. There were moments when I came home and felt, inexplicably, as if someone had been inside while I was gone. Then, the incidents escalated. One night, I returned from work to find my front door wide open, a chill running down my spine as I stepped inside, my keys clutched tightly in my hand as the only weapon I had. My living room was in chaos. Cushions torn, drawers yanked open, my grandmother's antique clock smashed into pieces on the floor. Yet nothing was stolen. The only thing left behind was a note on the kitchen counter, its message chilling in its simplicity. "This should have never been yours." I knew. I knew before I even checked the security cameras. And when I did, my worst suspicions were confirmed. There she was, Lily, standing in my living room, tearing through my belongings with a wild, frenzied look in her eyes, her lips curling into a smirk before she walked up to the camera and unplugged it. I called my parents immediately, my hands shaking with rage. She broke into my house. My mother sighed, as if I was being dramatic. "Sarah, she was probably just upset. You know how emotional she gets. She trashed my house and left a threat." "You don't know that for sure," my father said dismissively. "She's your sister. Try to be understanding." That was it. That was all they had to say. No anger. No concern. No acknowledgement of the fact that their precious Lily had broken into my home and left a message making it clear that she believed the house should have been hers. A week later, it happened again. Only this time it was worse. I came home late to the smell of smoke, my heart slamming against my ribs as I rushed inside to find my kitchen in ruins. The cabinets were blackened, the table reduced to ash, the air thick with the acrid scent of something deliberately set aflame. Someone had tried to burn my house down. When I confronted my parents the next day, I expected, hoped even, that this would be the moment they finally saw the truth, that this would be the moment they stopped making excuses. But my mother simply shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. Why do you always assume the worst about your sister? Because she has been tormenting me for months. You always exaggerate, my father added with an exasperated sigh. She wouldn't do something like that. That was when I knew, with absolute certainty, that they would never choose me. That no matter what Lily did, they would find a way to excuse it. That as far as they were concerned, she was their priority, and I was nothing more than an afterthought. I exhaled, feeling something inside me harden, feeling something finally break. Then you can consider me done with this family. I turned, walking away without looking back. And for the first time in my life, I never imagined my grandparents' deaths would come with betrayal, but looking back, maybe I should have known better. They were the only ones in my life who had ever truly loved me without conditions, without treating me as less important than Lily, and in a way that had always set them apart from the rest of my family. Their home had been my sanctuary growing up, the one place I felt safe, the one place I wasn't ignored or pushed aside, and now that they were gone, all I had left of them was their memory, and as I had been told, their final gift to me. The day of the will reading, I arrived at the law office with a tight knot in my stomach, still grieving, still raw from losing them, but a small part of me held on to the idea that, even in death, my grandparents had looked out for me. I knew they had left me their house, the same one where I had spent most of my childhood, the same one filled with the warmth of my grandmother's cooking and the sound of my grandfather's laughter. It was worth around $1.2 million, not that I cared about the money, it was the home itself that mattered to me. Along with the house, they had also left me a part of their inheritance, $500,000, something that would ensure I had stability, something that, for once, proved I was not invisible in my own family. My parents, Diane and Thomas, sat stiffly across from me in the lawyer's office, their expressions unreadable, while Lily, dressed in a simple, almost demure outfit, sat beside them, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked out of place, quiet, uncharacteristically composed, her eyes wide with what almost looked like innocence. I had seen her play this act before. The lawyer, a stern-looking man named Richard Calloway, cleared his throat and unfolded a document, glancing at us over the rim of his glasses before he began to read. I sat up straighter, bracing myself, expecting to hear what I had already been told. But the moment he started speaking, the words came out wrong. Henry and Margaret Livingston, in their final will and testament, leave their estate, including the house at 237 Oakwood Lane, as well as their financial assets, to their granddaughter, Lily Livingston. My body went cold. There had to be a mistake. I blinked, staring at the lawyer, my mouth opening, then closing, my brain scrambling to process what I had just heard. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a dull, sickening thud. What? My voice sounded strange, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Richard barely glanced at me as he continued reading, listing out the details, the full transfer of ownership, the assets, every last penny going directly to Lily. My parents sat in silence, not even pretending to be shocked, as if they had known this was coming, as if they had expected it. But Lily had the audacity to gasp, her hand flying to her mouth in exaggerated surprise. "Oh my God," she whispered, shaking her head as if she had just been struck with unexpected news. I didn't know about this." I turned to her, my stomach twisting, bile rising in my throat. "You're lying." She flinched, putting on an innocent, wounded expression, her eyes wide, her lips trembling just slightly. "Sarah, I swear I had no idea." The room was spinning. I looked at Richard, my fingers digging into my palms. "That's not possible. I was told they left the house to me. That's what they wanted. They told me themselves." Richard, for the first time, hesitated. He sighed, adjusting his glasses before looking directly at me. "I understand this is difficult, Miss Livingston, but this is the most recent version of the will. It was updated 3 months before their passing." My breath caught in my throat. 3 months. I felt sick. 3 months before they died, my grandparents had still been alive, still perfectly lucid, still making their own decisions, or at least, they should have been. But 3 months ago was also the exact time when my parents had started taking control over everything. It was when they had insisted my grandparents stop driving, when they had started managing their bank accounts, when they had begun speaking on their behalf whenever we discussed anything related to the future. It was when they had first begun to shut me out. I could barely hear anything else Richard said. My mother placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the satisfaction beneath it, the way she wasn't the least bit upset. "I know this is disappointing for you, Sarah," my father finally said, his tone condescending, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum over a toy. "But your grandparents must have changed their minds." No, they wouldn't have. They had promised me. They had told me in their own words that the house was mine, that they wanted me to have it because they knew I would take care of it, because they knew I was the one who loved it the most. They had made that decision because they knew what Lily would do. How she would sell it the moment it became hers, how she would strip it of everything that made it home. I turned back to Richard, my hands shaking. "I want to see the will. The original one. Before this was changed." Richard hesitated. "That version is no longer legally relevant." "I don't care. I want to see it." A long pause. Then, finally, he nodded and reached for a different file, pulling out an earlier document. He slid it across the table, and the moment my eyes landed on it, my worst suspicions were confirmed. The original will, dated a year earlier, left everything to me. The house, the money, the inheritance that my grandparents had intended for me. And then, suddenly, 3 months ago, it had all been rewritten. I lifted my gaze to Lily, who was now staring down at her lap, playing the role of the reluctant recipient, as if she were embarrassed by all the attention. But I could see it, the flicker of triumph behind her downcast eyes, the way the corners of her lips twitched ever so slightly. "You did this," I whispered, my voice low and shaking with barely restrained rage. Lily looked up at me, blinking innocently. "Sarah, you or Mom and Dad, someone forced them to change this." "That's a serious accusation," my father cut in sharply. "And frankly, it's insulting to your grandparents' memory. They made this choice on their own." I clenched my fists so tightly my nails bit into my skin. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make them see the truth, but I already knew it wouldn't matter. They had done this. Somehow, they had manipulated my grandparents, coerced them, tricked them, something. And now, because of it, I had nothing. Lily reached across the table, placing a hand over mine in a show of fake sympathy. "I really didn't know," she murmured, her voice soft and sickeningly sweet. "But maybe this is for the best. Maybe it's what they thought was right." I yanked my hand away from her touch as if it burned. This wasn't over. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to find out the truth. And when I did, they were all going to regret this. I couldn't sleep after the will reading. My mind replayed every moment of it like a broken record, each detail etching itself deeper into my thoughts, filling me with rage and something worse, betrayal so sharp it felt like a blade in my chest. My grandparents had left everything to me. I knew that with absolute certainty, not because I wanted it to be true, but because they had told me themselves. They had made their wishes clear, and now, somehow, their will had been rewritten just weeks before their deaths, with Lily coming out as the sole beneficiary. It didn't add up. It didn't make sense. And I refused to accept it. I started digging. At first, I wasn't sure where to begin. My parents weren't going to tell me the truth. Lily would play dumb, act like she had no idea, and the lawyer, Richard Calloway, seemed like the kind of man who only cared about what was legal, not what was right. But my grandparents had always been meticulous about keeping records. If something had changed in their will, there had to be evidence of what came before it. The house, my house, wasn't mine anymore, but that didn't stop me from going back. I still had a key, and I still knew the place better than anyone. Late that night, when I was sure my parents and Lily wouldn't be lurking around, I drove to the house and let myself in. The air smelled the same, like old wood and faint traces of my grandmother's lavender sachets, but the warmth was gone. It felt hollow, stripped of everything that had made it home. I went straight to my grandfather's study. He had always kept everything in order. Bank statements, legal documents, anything important went into the heavy oak filing cabinet in the corner of the room. I rifled through the drawers, my fingers shaking slightly as I sorted through papers, searching for anything that resembled the will I had once known. And then, buried beneath a stack of old tax documents, I found it. A copy of the original will. I sat on the floor, my breath caught in my throat as I read the words that confirmed what I already knew. To our beloved granddaughter, Sarah Livingston, we leave our home at 237 Oakwood Lane, along with financial assets totaling $500,000. It had been real. It had been mine. And then it had been taken. The paper crumpled slightly in my grip as a cold, burning anger settled in my stomach. This was proof. This was what I needed to show that something had gone horribly wrong. But a copy of an old will wasn't enough. I needed to know how it had changed. There was only one person who could answer that. Richard Calloway. The next morning, I showed up at his office unannounced. The receptionist looked startled when I stormed past her desk, my hands clenched into fists at my sides as I pushed into Calloway's office without knocking. He looked up, his expression a mix of irritation and surprise. "Miss Livingston, this is highly unprofessional." I slapped the old will onto his desk. "Explain this." His eyes flickered down to the document, and for the first time, I saw something in his face that I hadn't before, hesitation. "Where did you get this?" His voice was measured, controlled, but I wasn't in the mood for his games. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that this was the original will. The one my grandparents wrote before it magically changed to give everything to Lily." I leaned forward, my voice dropping into something sharper, deadlier. "And I want to know why." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then slowly, he removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Miss Livingston, you don't understand how these things work. Don't patronize me." His mouth tightened. I could see the internal war happening behind his eyes, the battle between protecting his reputation and finally telling the truth. I pressed harder. "I have proof this will existed. If I take this to another lawyer, to the authorities, how do you think that's going to look? If you don't tell me the truth now, I'll make sure your name is dragged through the mud." That did it. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time, he looked guilty. "Lily was heavily involved in the will's revision," he admitted, his voice quiet. "She visited the office multiple times in the weeks leading up to your grandparents' passing. She was adamant about ensuring the new documents were finalized quickly." I felt my stomach churn. "Are you telling me she manipulated them into changing it?" Calloway hesitated. "I'm telling you that she was persistent. Your grandparents were already in poor health. She made sure she was the one handling most of their affairs. And when the new will was signed, well, they weren't exactly in the best state to make clear decisions. A sick feeling crawled up my spine. "You knew," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You knew they weren't in the right state of mind, and you let it happen." He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I was under pressure. Your parents were involved too." By the time everything was finalized, there was nothing I could do. I felt like I was going to be sick. But it wasn't just about the will. There was more to this. If Lily had gone this far, if she had been so desperate to get her hands on the money, what had she already done with it? The answer came faster than I expected. I did some digging, pulling up financial records, social media posts, anything that could show me what Lily had been up to in the weeks following my grandparents' death. It didn't take long to find the proof. A $150,000 luxury car, shiny and pristine, sitting in our parents' driveway. A lavish vacation in the Bahamas, complete with yacht parties, 5-star resorts, and endless cocktails, all documented on her Instagram. A $50,000 shopping spree, designer clothes, jewelry, handbags, things she had never been able to afford before. She had already spent a massive portion of the inheritance. I stared at the photos, my blood boiling, my hands trembling with fury. She hadn't even tried to hide it. She had flaunted it, paraded it around like it was hers to enjoy, while I was left grieving, left picking up the pieces of a life she had stolen from me. This wasn't over. I didn't care what it took, didn't care how long I had to fight. I was going to expose her. I was going to take back what was mine. And when I did, Lily was going to regret ever thinking she could get away with this. I didn't hesitate. The moment I had proof that Lily had manipulated our grandparents, I knew what I had to do. I was done playing the quiet, obedient daughter, done letting my parents and Lily walk all over me. They had stolen from me, from my grandparents, and they had expected me to just accept it. But they were wrong. The day after I confronted Richard Calloway, I hired my own lawyer. His name was Daniel Carter, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for handling high-stakes inheritance disputes. I walked into his office with a folder full of documents, my hands trembling only slightly as I placed them on his desk. "I want to challenge the will," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "And I want to win." He flipped through the papers, scanning them quickly before meeting my gaze. "You have a strong case, but it's not going to be easy. These cases can drag out, and the burden of proof is on you." "Then I'll get proof." I spent the next several weeks gathering every piece of evidence I could find. The more I dug, the uglier the truth became. First, there was the forensic analysis of the will. Daniel arranged for a handwriting expert to examine the signatures on the updated document, and the results were damning. My grandparents' signatures had been forged. The strokes were inconsistent, the pressure off, the spacing unnatural. The expert was willing to testify in court that the signatures were fraudulent. Then came the recordings. I had reached out to a few extended relatives, cousins, great-aunts, anyone who had spent time with my grandparents in their final months. I didn't expect much, but what I found shocked me. My cousin Emily, who had always been close to my grandfather, had several old voicemails from him. One of them was recorded just 2 months before his death. "I just don't understand why Diane keeps bringing up the will," his voice crackled through the speaker. "We already made our decision. Sarah gets the house. It's what Margaret and I want." End of discussion. My stomach twisted as I listened. This was it. Proof. My grandparents had never wanted Lily to have anything. Emily also had another recording, one where my grandmother was talking to her about Lily. "She worries me, Margaret's voice was soft but troubled. "I love her, but she has no sense of responsibility. If we gave her the house, she'd sell it in a heartbeat. It's not just a home, it's our family's history. Sarah understands that." I sent everything to Daniel. But the most shocking piece of evidence came when we subpoenaed my grandparents' financial records. I expected to find some questionable activity, but I wasn't prepared for what we uncovered. Lily had been forging checks. Not just once, not just twice. Over the course of 6 months, she had stolen more than $200,000 from their accounts. The checks were made out to cash or deposited into her personal bank account. Some were used to pay off credit card bills, others for extravagant shopping sprees. She had been draining their money before they had even died, ensuring that by the time they passed, she would still come out on top. I stared at the documents in horror, my hands gripping the edges of the pages, so tightly they crumpled. "We have her," Daniel said, his voice calm but certain. "This is beyond inheritance fraud. This is criminal." The case went to court. My parents were livid. My father refused to speak to me, while my mother called me vindictive and accused me of tearing the family apart. But I didn't care. The family had already been broken, and it wasn't because of me. It was because of them. Lily showed up to the first hearing looking fragile and innocent, dressed in soft pastels, her eyes wide as she played the role of the poor, misunderstood younger sister. She tried to spin the narrative, claiming our grandparents had changed their minds on their own, that they had wanted her to have everything, but the evidence was stacked against her. The forensic expert took the stand, detailing how the signatures had been forged. Emily played the recordings, letting the courtroom hear my grandparents' own voices confirming that they had never wanted Lily to have anything. And then came the bank records. When confronted with the forged checks, Lily's mask slipped. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her carefully curated image cracking as the judge examined the documents. "They would have given me that money anyway." "That's not how the law works, Miss Livingston," the judge replied coldly. My parents sat in the gallery, their faces pale and unreadable. For the first time in my life, I saw something in my mother's expression that almost resembled doubt. But it didn't matter. Nothing they said now could undo what had been done. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The verdict was clear. The court declared the updated will invalid and reinstated the original will. The house was mine. The inheritance was mine. Everything that had been stolen from me, taken through lies and deception, was restored. Lily was charged with fraud. She had spent nearly all the money she had stolen, and what remained would have to be paid back. She sobbed in court, begging for leniency, but the judge wasn't moved. She had dug her own grave. When it was over, I walked out of the courtroom with my head held high. I had won. And for the first time in my life, I knew that justice had finally been served. The trial was over. I had won. The house was mine. The inheritance was reinstated, and the truth about Lily had finally been dragged into the light for everyone to see. But victory wasn't the end of this story. It was only the beginning of the fallout. Lily was unraveling. She refused to accept the court's decision, refused to acknowledge what she had done, and instead convinced herself that she was the victim. The moment the judge ruled against her, she filed for an appeal, desperate to claw back what she had lost. But her chances were slim. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Fraud, forgery, stolen money, and no judge in their right mind was going to overturn the verdict. That didn't stop her from trying. She burned through what little remained of her stolen inheritance on legal fees, hiring a new lawyer, some flashy, overconfident fraud named Gregory Henshaw, who promised her redemption and justice if she paid him enough. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because it became clear that Henshaw didn't care about her case, he cared about bleeding her dry. Within weeks, Lily was drowning in debt. Creditors started calling. Bills piled up. Her extravagant lifestyle, the one she had built on stolen money, began to crumble beneath her. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. One afternoon, as I was driving past my parents' house, the house she still lived in, I saw a tow truck parked in the driveway. And there, standing on the front lawn in her expensive designer dress, was Lily, screaming at a repo agent as he secured her $150,000 luxury car to the tow truck. I parked across the street and watched. "You can't take this," she shrieked, her voice bordering on hysteria. "This is a mistake. I paid for this." The repo agent, a burly man in his 40s, didn't even flinch. "Ma'am, the payment stopped 3 months ago. The bank owns this car now. I just need more time. I have an appeal." "Not my problem." With that, he climbed into the tow truck and drove off, dragging her precious car away as Lily collapsed onto the lawn, sobbing. I should have felt bad. A better person might have. But I didn't. She had stolen from our grandparents. She had tried to ruin my life. And now, for the first time, she was facing actual consequences. And that was only the beginning. Word spread fast. The trial had been public, and while my parents had tried to keep it quiet, the truth couldn't be hidden forever. My family had always been respected in our town. My father was a well-known businessman, my mother active in community events, but now their daughter was a convicted fraud. Lily lost friends. People who used to flock to her, who had joined her on extravagant vacations and partied on yachts, suddenly weren't answering her calls. She was toxic now, a liability, and without money, without status, she had nothing to offer them. Her job search was a disaster. Employers didn't want to hire someone with fraud charges hanging over their head, and the ones who did were offering minimum wage positions, far beneath the life she had built for herself. She was drowning, and no one was coming to save her. Not even my parents. At first, they had been her biggest defenders. They had stood by her, made excuses, acted as though I was the villain for exposing her crimes. But as the months dragged on, something shifted. I think it started when they saw what she really was without money to prop her up. She became unbearable. The once spoiled, entitled princess was now a bitter, resentful, angry mess, snapping at them for not fixing things, for not finding a way to make her problems disappear. And for the first time, they couldn't. They had spent so many years protecting her, shielding her from consequences. But now, when it truly mattered, they were powerless. And they hated it. Then came the moment I never expected. One evening, I was home when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Sarah, it's Dad. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. My father hadn't spoken to me since the trial ended. He had been furious with me, refusing to acknowledge what Lily had done. And now he wanted to talk? I hesitated, then typed out a reply. "Why?" A few seconds later, another text came through. "I just want to see you. Please." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a quiet diner on the edge of town, the kind of place we never would have gone to as a family. It was small, dimly lit, half empty. My father was already there when I arrived, sitting at a booth near the window, looking older. He had always been a strong man, authoritative, commanding. But now he looked tired, weary. I slid into the seat across from him, crossing my arms. "What do you want?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together before looking at me. I was wrong. I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "I was wrong," he repeated, his voice quieter this time. "About everything. About Lily. About you." I didn't say anything. He sighed, running a hand over his face. "Your mother and I, we let things go too far. We wanted to believe Lily was still the little girl we used to know. the one who just needed extra love, extra support. But that's not who she is anymore. And we see that now. I stared at him, searching for any sign of insincerity, but there was none. We were unfair to you, Sarah. 4 years. We pushed you aside, made you feel like you weren't enough. And I wish I could take it back. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing my voice to stay even. Why are you telling me this now? Because we lost you, he admitted. And we don't want to lose you forever. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to tell him it was too late, that he didn't get to come crawling back now that Lily had burned every bridge. But deep down, I had wanted to hear these words my entire life. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally. Not yet. I understand. He nodded. But maybe one day? I hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Maybe. It wasn't an apology that could undo years of hurt. It didn't erase the pain, the neglect, the way they had chosen Lily over me time and time again. But it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The day I officially took back my grandparents' house, I stood outside for a long time, just staring at it. The home that had once been stolen from me, the place that Lily had tried to erase from my life, was finally mine again. But it didn't feel the same. The windows, once so warm and inviting, looked cold. The porch, where I had sat with my grandfather on summer evenings, now creaked under my feet, weathered by time and neglect. The front door still had the scratches from the day Lily had broken in, reminders of how close I had come to losing everything. I wasn't just going to live here. I was going to restore it. For the next 6 months, I poured everything I had into renovating the house. I hired the best contractors I could find, using nearly $100,000 of my inheritance to bring the house back to life. The roof was replaced, the old plumbing redone, the walls repainted in the warm, inviting tones my grandparents had loved. The kitchen, my grandmother's kitchen, became my biggest project. I had the cabinets refinished instead of replacing them, keeping the same structure she had cooked in for decades. I found a vintage stove, one almost identical to the one she had used to bake cookies for me when I was little. Every detail was carefully chosen, every change made with the intention of preserving the love that had once filled this home. I went through old photos, finding pictures of my grandparents in their younger years, and framed them throughout the house. I restored my grandfather's study, placing his old books exactly where they had been before Lily's destruction. And when it was done, when the last coat of paint had dried and the final piece of furniture had been placed, I stepped inside and finally felt at home. But I didn't stop there. The months of rebuilding had made me think a lot about my grandparents, not just what they had left me, but what they had stood for. They had spent their entire lives helping others. My grandmother used to bake for the neighbors just because she wanted to brighten their day. My grandfather had always been the first to volunteer when someone needed their fence repaired or their car fixed. So I decided to continue their legacy. With part of my inheritance, I started a charity in their honor, Livingston Home Foundation. It was dedicated to helping elderly homeowners with necessary home repairs, fixing leaky roofs, repairing broken steps, making sure they could live comfortably without the fear of their home falling apart around them. The first project we completed was for Mrs. Conway, an 82-year-old woman who had lived in our neighborhood for as long as I could remember. Her front steps had rotted away, making it dangerous for her to even leave her house. We built new ones, sturdy and safe, and when she stepped outside for the first time in months, she hugged me with tears in her eyes. "Your grandparents would be so proud of you," she whispered. And for the first time in a long time, I felt it. Peace. Not just because I had won the court case. Not just because I had gotten back what was stolen from me. But because I was doing something that mattered. Not everyone had turned on me during the lawsuit, but there were plenty of relatives who had believed Lily's lies, who had whispered behind my back that I was selfish or jealous or cruel for taking her to court. One by one, they started reaching out. "Sarah, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't realize what was really going on. I feel terrible for believing Lily over you. She fooled all of us. If you ever need anything, please let me know. I want to make it up to you." I didn't forgive them all immediately. Some wounds take time to heal. But it meant something, knowing they finally saw the truth. That they understood I had never been the villain in this story. And then, of course, there was Lily. She showed up one evening, standing on my newly repaired porch, looking nothing like the sister I had once known. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by something simpler, something more desperate. There were dark circles under her eyes, her once perfectly manicured nails chipped and uneven. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I folded my arms. "What do you want, Lily?" She let out a small, shaky laugh. "Do I need a reason to see my sister?" "Yes. Considering the last time we spoke, you were trying to steal everything from me." She winced. "Look, I know things got bad between us. I want to fix things. Fix things." I repeated, my voice sharp. "You ruined my grandparents' final years. You stole from them while they were still alive. You forged their signatures. You tried to take everything from me, and now you want to just fix things." She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to defend herself. Instead, she sighed and looked away. I don't want us to hate each other forever." For a moment, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I saw it, the flicker of arrogance, the lack of real remorse. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't admitting to anything. She just wanted back in because she had nowhere else to go. "I don't hate you, Lily," I said, my voice steady. "But I don't trust you either." Her shoulders slumped. So that's it. That's it. She stared at me for a long moment, then nodded, as if she had expected this. Without another word, she turned and walked away. I watched her go, waiting for the usual ache to hit me, the old longing for the sister I wished I had. But it didn't come. Instead, I turned and stepped back into my home, the house filled with memories of the people who had truly loved me, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Because I had done the right thing. Because I had honored my grandparents. Because, for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be.